Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Wednesday, December 10th, 2025, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 82.8 degrees, with a low dipping to 51.4 overnight, so enjoy the mild weather but keep an eye on those evening chills. Coming up on the show, we'll break down Israel's decision to reject Hamas's proposal for conditional disarmament and its implications for peace talks in the region. We'll also examine the hurdles facing the Federal Reserve's potential interest rate reductions in 2026 after this month's cut, and what it means for the economy heading into the new year. Plus, coverage of other key developments from around the world. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. This morning, a potential turning point in Gaza that's already hitting a wall. Hamas says it might disarm under certain conditions, and Israel is rejecting the terms. Ethan's here to walk us through where things stand. Ethan, what's the headline today?
The big development is that Hamas has signaled it could freeze or store its weapons for 5 to 10 years, but only if there are international guarantees and a pathway to a Palestinian state on pre-1967 borders. Israel says that's a non-starter and insists on immediate total disarmament with no political concessions. NPR framed it today as a historic but conditional offer, colliding with Israel's red lines, which is why talks are stalled. The Washington Post adds that this clash is blocking the U.S.-backed Trump plan from moving into its crucial second phase.
So this is all happening under a U.S.-brokered plan from the Trump administration. What's the plan supposed to do?
The plan is a phased process endorsed by the UN last month. Resolution 2803 passed on November 17th, 3 weeks ago today. Phase 1 focuses on hostage releases and scaled-up aid. Phase 2 is disarmament and Israeli withdrawal. Later phases tackle reconstruction under international oversight. The New York Times described the October 10th ceasefire, 2 months ago today, as the fragile on-ramp to that sequence. But the Post reports progress is stuck because the sides can't agree on how and when disarmament happens.
What exactly is Hamas putting on the table, and why does Israel say no?
Hamas leaders, including Hussam Badran, have floated freezing weapons for 5, 7, or 10 years, which Al Jazeera noted, and the Post cross-checked in a December 4th analysis. They want U.S., Egyptian, and Qatari guarantees they won't be attacked, plus full Israeli withdrawal and recognition of a Palestinian state along the 1967 lines. The Times cites Hamas official Musa Abu Marzouk saying, quote, "Without statehood, no disarmament," end quote. Israeli officials, according to NPR and the Washington Post, argue that linking disarmament to statehood invites rearmament and undermines security.
How firm is Israel's position right now?
Very firm. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Military Chief Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, as reported by the Washington Post and NPR, demand a complete disarmament within months, not years, and won't tie it to political concessions. The Times reported just yesterday that Israel treats the so-called yellow line in Gaza as a forward defensive line, signaling a long-term security presence. Israeli sources told the Post Hamas's conditions create a catch-22. They won't pull back until Hamas disarms, but Hamas won't disarm without a pullback and statehood.
You mentioned the October 10th ceasefire. How fragile is it 2 months in?
Very fragile, and violations are piling up. Gaza's government media office claims more than 700 Israeli breaches since October 10th. Bombings, shootings, demolitions, with hundreds of deaths and injuries. Al Jazeera carried those figures, which UN OCHA situation reports, cited by the Post on December 8th, partly corroborate. UN human rights experts documented hundreds of incidents by late November, including dozens of child deaths. Israel, via claims reported in the Times of Israel and referenced by NPR, accuses Hamas of over 200 breaches, including moving operatives and attacks on soldiers.
How did we get here? Can you remind us of the war's toll?
The war began after Hamas's October 7, 2023 assault, which killed about 200 people, mostly civilians, and led to 251 abductions, according to multiple outlets. Israel's offensive in Gaza has killed more than 70,000 Palestinians, per Gaza health authorities cited by the New York Times, and displaced nearly 2 million, the Washington Post's tracking shows. NPR Today called it a catastrophic 2-year toll, and aid groups warn of famine and disease amid massive infrastructure collapse. The ceasefire paused the worst fighting but hasn't reversed the humanitarian freefall.
What's the state of humanitarian aid and access right now?
Still far below targets. The ceasefire envisions 600 trucks a day. OCHA reporting, cited by the Post, says deliveries are well short, and winter is compounding the crisis for over 1 million people without shelter or supplies. The Rafah crossing is the choke point. Resolution 2803 and Egyptian statements called for full reopening, but Israel has kept it mostly sealed, citing hostage noncompliance. Egypt rejected a recent Israeli proposal for exit-only access, insisting on two-way flow, which OCHA confirms has not been restored.
Hostages have shaped these talks from the start. Where do things stand now?
The Post's December 4th tracker counts 251 hostages taken in 2023. Most have been released or confirmed dead. Only a small number remain unresolved, including a recently identified Thai worker's remains. The Times profiled freed hostage Emily Damari, who described trauma from tunnel captivity, and families marked the October 7th anniversary with calls to push Phase 2. NPR notes that until there's clarity on the last cases and disarmament timelines, the ceasefire's next steps are hard to unlock.
The plan also calls for an international stabilization force in Gaza. What is that, and is it coming?
It's the ISF, authorized by the November 17th UN resolution to deploy in early 2026 to secure areas, train Palestinian police, and oversee demilitarization. The Washington Post reported on November 29th that the U.S. is struggling to assemble it. Countries like Indonesia, Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan are wary of clashing with Hamas. The mandate is murky. NPR affiliates noted it's under a unified command tied to a Trump-chaired Board of Peace, but it's unclear how it would operate in Hamas-run areas. The Times says the ISF would replace the IDF based on demilitarization milestones, yet Israel wants a security perimeter until 2027.
We've heard about Jared Kushner reappearing in this process. How significant is that?
More significant than initially advertised. The Washington Post reported yesterday that despite early vows to stay out, Kushner has become a key negotiator within the Trump team. President Trump himself pitched this as a new kind of peace process, bringing in Muslim allies like Saudi Arabia. But as the Times notes, that broader regional architecture can't substitute for resolving the disarmament statehood impasse.
What about politics on the Israeli side? Any moves that complicate trust?
Several. The Times reported that Israel authorized 22 new West Bank settlements, the biggest expansion in decades, which undercuts expectations of territorial compromise. The Post also highlighted Israel's support for local anti-Hamas militias in Gaza, including the Popular Forces, led by Yasser Abu Shabab, who was killed in a clan clash on December 4th, underscoring the risks of outsourcing security. These steps deepen Palestinian skepticism that disarmament would ever lead to statehood.
And what's Hamas signaling inside Gaza about this disarmament offer?
It's presenting the offer as a pragmatic pause, not surrender. According to NPR's segment today and the Washington Post's analysis, Hamas would bury or store offensive capabilities and halt operations if guaranteed no attacks and a route to sovereignty. Critics inside the movement fear it's a trap. Supporters say it gives war-weary Gazans breathing room. The Times quotes leaders acknowledging the devastation while insisting the political horizon must come first.
How are violations at the front lines affecting the ceasefire's future?
Each incident erodes trust and gives hardliners ammunition. UNOHCHR and OCHA logs, cited by the Post, document hundreds of breaches, including retaliatory airstrikes after attacks on troops that killed more than 100 people from late October into November. Israel points to Hamas's alleged movements and attempts to regroup. NPR warns that if accountability mechanisms don't kick in soon, the October 10th truce could unravel before Phase 2 begins.
Where does the U.S. fit in beyond brokering talks?
The U.S. has stepped up monitoring and leverage. The New York Times reported that Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced troop deployments to help oversee the truce, signaling deeper American stakes. At the same time, the Post says senators want probes into alleged Israeli human rights violations based on the 2025 State Department report, which could complicate military aid decisions. And NPR notes that Trump's strained rhetoric with NATO allies may blunt U.S. pressure on partners needed for the ISF.
Internationally, is there movement toward Palestinian statehood recognition?
Yes, but it's uneven. The New York Times reports France, Luxembourg, and others are moving toward recognition, raising diplomatic pressure on Israel. Meanwhile, Israel's media restrictions on Gaza access and raids on UN facilities like UNRWA, as covered by multiple outlets, are isolating Jerusalem and parts of Europe. The dynamic raises the cost of ignoring the political track, even as security demands dominate.
What are aid groups in the UN saying about conditions on the ground right now?
They're sounding the alarm. The Post cites OCHA and humanitarian NGOs warning of looming famine, surging disease, and widespread exposure as winter sets in. Hospitals, water systems, and homes remain shattered. The Times has repeatedly documented near-total infrastructure collapse. Aid agencies argue that without sustained access and power, reconstruction can't even start, let alone succeed.
If the ISF is delayed and the ceasefire keeps cracking, what's the next best option?
Mediators want incremental swaps, limited hostage releases in exchange for specific disarmament steps, plus verified pauses for aid surges. NPR says Egypt and Qatar are pushing for a rolling series of micro-deals to build momentum into Phase 2. The risk is that spoilers on either side can sabotage confidence at any point. The Post's editorial board argued last month that reconstruction funds should be conditioned on verifiable disarmament to create real incentives.
Israel's yellow line sounds like a long-term buffer. How does that square with withdrawal promises?
It's a core tension. The Times described the yellow line as a forward defensive belt that Israel wants to hold until it's convinced Hamas can't rearm. The UN plan links IDF drawdowns to demilitarization milestones, but if Israel keeps a security perimeter through 2027, as the Post reports, full withdrawal slips out of reach. That undercuts Hamas's incentive to disarm, creating a loop of mistrust.
Any sign that Saudi Arabia or other regional players could break the stalemate?
They're willing to support reconstruction and political cover, but not to police Gaza. The Post says countries like Indonesia and Pakistan are cautious about the ISF. Turkey and Egypt, too, fear being drawn into clashes. Saudi backing is tied to a credible political horizon, which is precisely what's in dispute. As NPR put it, regional buy-in depends on resolving the core conditionality of disarmament for statehood.
What are you hearing about public sentiment after 2 years of war?
Exhaustion and skepticism. NPR highlighted how repeated ceasefires collapsed under mutual recriminations, leaving civilians doubtful any plan will hold. In Israel, families of hostages press for deals, while security hawks resist concessions. In Gaza, survival eclipses politics, and many fear disarmament without guarantees will lock in occupation. That's the human backdrop to these hard policy choices.
Given all this, what's the most plausible path forward in the next few weeks?
A narrow one, a verified mini-deal trading a small hostage tranche for initial weapons storage steps, plus expanded aid corridors at Rafah. The U.S., per the Times, is leaning on both sides to use the UN resolution as a roadmap and let the ISF planning continue in parallel. If that unlocks trust, negotiators could test Hamas's 5 to 10-year freeze concept with strict monitoring. If not, NPR warns the ceasefire could fracture as early as January, and the humanitarian crisis will deepen.
Bottom line, Ethan, what's at stake if this stalls out?
Everything the plan promised, demilitarization, reconstruction, and a political horizon. The Washington Post argues reconstruction simply won't happen without credible disarmament. The New York Times adds that any durable quiet requires addressing Palestinian statehood demands in some form. And NPR's Daniel Estrin said today that without bridging this core condition, quote, the truce risks unraveling into 2026, end quote. 2 months after the ceasefire, and 3 weeks after the UN resolution, time and public patience are running out.
Sobering but important context. Ethan, thanks for breaking it down for us.
Thank you, Grace.
This morning, all eyes are on the Federal Reserve. It's the final day of its December meeting, and a rate cut looks likely. Chloe's with us. What's at stake today?
A lot, Grace. The Associated Press, in reporting published on Yahoo Finance, says the Fed is widely expected to trim its benchmark rate by a quarter point for a third straight meeting, aiming to support a job market that's clearly losing steam. That would take the target range to 3.5% to 3.75% as of today, December 10th, 2025. But it's a tricky call because inflation's still above the Fed's 2% target, which normally argues for staying put.
If inflation's still running hot, why cut again now?
The labor side of the Fed's mandate has softened more than officials expected. AP notes unemployment reached 4.4% in September, a 4-year high, and it's been rising for 3 months, while private sector hints point to more layoffs and weak hiring. So the Fed's trying to cushion the slowdown without letting price pressures reignite. As Yale economist and former Fed staffer William English told AP, it's a tricky environment where, quote, perfectly sensible people, end quote, can disagree.
And we're talking about a quarter-point move, right?
That's right. The AP's Christopher Rugaber reports the consensus is a 0.25 percentage point cut, taking the Fed funds range down 1 notch. It's consistent with the gradual approach Chair Jerome Powell has signaled all year, moving slowly, watching the data, and trying to avoid big surprises. It also keeps optionality if inflation doesn't cooperate.
You mentioned disagreement. How contentious is this inside the Fed?
More than usual. CBS News and The Guardian echo AP's reporting that this could be one of Powell's toughest tests of leadership, with up to 3 dissents expected among the 12 voters, potentially the most in 6 years, according to economists tracked by J.P. Morgan and Deloitte. And there's political noise. President Donald Trump has publicly slammed Powell, calling him, quote, a clown, end quote, which adds pressure as Powell's term ends in May 2026.
What's making the data so confusing for them right now?
A 43-day federal government shutdown that ended November 12th created big gaps in the numbers central bankers rely on. BLS and BEA notices, cited by outlets like Paychecks and ROAC.ai, show some core reports were canceled, delayed, or published without complete details. That means policymakers are leaning more on private indicators and partial government data than they'd like. As former Fed official Nathan Sheets told AP, that tends to make the Fed more cautious.
Which releases are the most delayed or disrupted?
The October jobs report was canceled outright, and the November employment situation, normally out last Friday, doesn't arrive until December 16th, so next Tuesday. The November CPI is scheduled for December 18th, but will skip certain one-month comparisons because October's data are incomplete. The October all-item CPI won't be published at all. Producer prices for October won't be known until the January 14th release of November PPI, and some state-level employment reports were scrapped.
Without those, what are they looking at for jobs?
Private indicators fill some gaps. AP's coverage cites ADP's estimate of 32,000 job losses in November, and we've seen announcements of layoffs from major firms, which underscore cooling demand for workers. The job openings report that did arrive shows 7.7 million openings in October, near recent levels, which suggests the labor market isn't collapsing, but it's clearly less tight than a year ago. That mixed picture is why some economists expect what Nationwide's Kathy Bostjancic calls a hawkish cut.
A hawkish cut, meaning what, exactly?
Cut now to support jobs, then signal patience on what comes next. FX Street and The Street highlighted Bostoncic's view that the Fed could lower rates today, but hint at a pause while they absorb the data backlog at the late January meeting. AP's reporting also notes that the odds of follow-up cuts in 2026 have faded as inflation proves sticky and the economy sends mixed signals. In practice, that's a cut paired with tough talk on inflation.
Who's likely to dissent, and why?
The hawkish camp includes Kansas City Fed President Jeffrey Schmid, who already dissented last meeting to keep rates unchanged, and St. Louis Fed President Alberto Mussolini, who's a non-voter but vocal against more easing. On the other side, AP says Trump-appointed Governor Stephen Miron is poised to dissent because he wants a bigger half-point cut to jolt hiring. J.P. Morgan and Deloitte's economist surveys suggest 2 or even 3 no votes are possible, which would be an unusually close call for the Fed.
Tell us more about Stephen Miron's position.
According to federalreserve.gov and congress.gov, Miron was confirmed September 15th and sworn in the next day to serve out Adriana Kugler's term through January 31st, 2026. He previously chaired the White House Council of Economic Advisers, and AP notes Senate Democrats have questioned his independence given those ties. His stance is that a larger cut now would better protect jobs as hiring cools. So he's been dissenting for a more aggressive move.
Any strong voices on the dovish side backing today's cut?
New York Fed President John Williams, a key Powell ally and voter, recently said there's, quote, room for a further adjustment, end quote. As reported by the AP, he attributed part of the recent inflation flare to temporary forces like tariffs, and he expects those pressures to fade by mid-2026. After his comments, the CME FedWatch tool showed market odds for a December cut jumping to about 89% from under 30% right after the October meeting.
Do close votes matter for markets?
Yes. Fed Governor Christopher Waller has warned that votes that look like 8-4 or 7-5 could dent market confidence, as AP recounts. The Fed has a tradition of near unanimity, which some critics call groupthink, but which often stabilizes expectations. A split decision today wouldn't change the policy outcome, but it would color how investors interpret the Fed's resolve going forward.
How did markets trade heading into today?
The AP's Stan Cho, with colleagues, described a quiet session yesterday as investors waited for the decision and Powell's press conference. Stocks hovered near records. The S&P 500 nipped higher, the Dow slipped, and the Nasdaq edged up, while Treasury yields ticked up as traders factored in fewer cuts in 2026. Energy led gains, with ExxonMobil rallying on a stronger 5-year profit outlook, and healthcare was strong on CVS's upbeat guidance. On the flip side, names like AutoZone slumped on weak results, while Ares jumped on news it's joining the S&P 500.
And that job openings number you mentioned, how does that shape the debate?
It hints the labor market is cooling, not cracking. With 7.7 million openings in October, the highest since May, according to Wells Fargo advisors and other summaries, the urgency for a larger cut is less obvious. That's part of why a quarter-point move, paired with cautious guidance, looks like the compromise. It nudged the 2-year Treasury yield higher yesterday, which often mirrors expectations for Fed policy.
What about overseas markets?
Mixed and mostly cautious. The AP's market roundup noted Europe was flat to lower and Asia tilted down, with Hong Kong off more than 1%. Global investors are sensitive to how the Fed calibrates its message on 2026, since U.S. rates anchor borrowing costs worldwide. A hawkish tilt could ripple through currencies and equities abroad.
Let's talk projections. What might the Fed's dot plot show this time?
Fewer 2026 cuts than previously penciled in. As outlets like the Middletown Press and the Telegraph have highlighted, last December the Fed already trimmed its 2025 cut expectations, and persistent inflation plus data uncertainty likely push policymakers to mark a higher path for next year. AP's framing is that the near-term cut is about employment risks, but the longer path remains cloudy, so those dots could reinforce a slower glide path lower.
Could leadership changes shift that path next year?
They could. Powell's term ends in May 2026, and CBS News and JP Morgan commentary have discussed the possibility of Kevin Hassett, one of Trump's top economic advisors, as a successor, a pick that could tilt the Fed toward more aggressive easing. That prospect, plus a politically charged backdrop, raises the risk of a more polarized committee. Markets will be parsing any hints Powell gives about continuity and decision-making norms.
What will you listen for from Powell after the decision?
Whether he sells this as a one-and-done for now, or leaves the door cracked for a follow-up in early 2026. Nationwide's Bostiancic expects that hawkish cut tone, acknowledging labor weakness but stressing vigilance on inflation until the delayed data roll in. The AP's Rugaber describes this as a convoluted economy, and Powell will likely emphasize humility in the face of incomplete information. Clear guidance on the data dependencies could calm the bond market.
When do those key numbers finally hit?
The BLS says November jobs lands December 16th, so 1 week from today. CPI for November follows December 18th, albeit with gaps from October's missing pieces, and the PPI catch-up comes January 14th, when the November report finally includes October detail. The Fed's next gathering is late January, and officials are signaling that meeting is a better-informed checkpoint. Between now and then, every release will be magnified.
How does today's move filter down to households?
Gradually. According to CBS News coverage, cuts tend to ease borrowing costs over time, which can help on credit cards, auto loans, and especially adjustable-rate mortgages, though fixed mortgage rates also track longer-term yields that respond to Fed guidance. Builders like Toll Brothers still cite affordability pressures after rates spiked earlier this fall, and Home Depot just warned the 2026 home improvement market could contract about 1%. A steadier rate path could stabilize housing sentiment, but it won't flip overnight.
And for businesses and hiring?
A lower policy rate softens financial conditions, helping companies refinance and invest, which can support jobs. But the benefit depends on confidence that inflation is heading down. Otherwise, lenders and investors remain cautious. The AP's market piece notes some firms are thriving on specific tailwinds, like energy producers or healthcare, while others see demand wobble. That unevenness is exactly what makes the Fed reluctant to promise a long series of cuts.
Bottom line us, what's the near-term path after today?
If the Fed cuts a quarter point and signals patience, markets will pivot to the December 16th jobs report and the December 18th CPI for confirmation that inflation is cooling while hiring stays soft. Should both trends cooperate, late January could bring talk of another trim, as AP and the Street suggest. But a rebound in jobs or sticky prices would argue for a pause, and the dot plot likely sets expectations for fewer, not more, moves in 2026. The Fed's message today is balance support the labor market without blinking on inflation.
Chloe, thanks for walking us through it. We'll keep listeners updated when the decision and Powell's comments come out later today. Here are some other headlines. Borderline chaos in Southeast Asia, renewed heavy fighting along the Thailand-Cambodia frontier has exploded since December 10th, forcing more than 500,000 people to hit the road under fire. Artillery shells, BM-21 rockets, and airstrikes have rattled disputed temple zones, including Priya Vihar and Tam Muan Tam. Thai officials say roughly 400,000 residents have been evacuated from 4 border provinces. Cambodia reports over 100,000 people have fled to schools, pagodas, and shelters. The clashes shattered a fragile ceasefire brokered earlier this year by U.S. President Donald Trump, who now vows to step back in. The fallout spilled into sports, with Cambodia pulling its athletes from the Southeast Asian Games in Thailand over safety concerns, turning friendly matches into the latest collateral damage. In Europe's security script, no rewrite from Kyiv, President Volodymyr Zelensky reaffirmed he will not surrender Ukrainian territory to Russia, calling any such deal devoid of legal or moral grounding. On a whirlwind tour through London, Paris, and Rome, he pushed back against a U.S.-floated framework said to trade Donbass concessions for a ceasefire and signaled a counterproposal that keeps Ukraine's sovereignty intact. With meetings alongside UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, France's Emmanuel Macron, and Germany's Friedrich Merz, Zelensky sought to stitch a seamless European front. The alliance is walking a tightrope: end the war quickly or avoid freezing it on Moscow's terms. The next act may determine whether the West stays in concert or goes off-key. Big bites in Bharat. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella unveiled a $17.5 billion bet on India across 2026 to 2029, the company's largest capital commitment in Asia. The push centers on sovereign-ready, hyperscale cloud, including a new Hyderabad data center region slated to switch on by mid-2026. The plan plugs AI into public platforms like eShram and the National Career Service to support more than 310 million informal workers, while doubling Microsoft's skilling target to 20 million people in AI fluency by 2030. New Delhi's AI-first digital economy is getting both a hard drive and a driving hand, upgrading from digital public infrastructure to AI public infrastructure with data sovereignty as the root password. The EPA's climate page gets a hot edit and colder on carbon. The agency has stripped fossil fuels from the top of its causes of climate change explainer, pivoting to natural drivers like volcanoes and solar shifts. The changes, made in early December under Administrator Lee Zeldin, drew swift fire from scientists. EPA Press Secretary Bridget Hirsch said the agency is no longer taking marching orders from the climate cult. National Academy of Sciences President Marcia McNutt called the rewrite misleading, warning it clouds the public's view and signals a broader rollback of climate transparency. Abroad, the shift is raising temperatures in diplomatic circles after prior U.S. exits from global climate pacts. And at the High Court, a life-or-death decimal point, the Supreme Court heard Ham versus Smith, weighing Alabama's bid to reinstate the death sentence of Joseph Clifton Smith. The legal crux: whether Smith qualifies as intellectually disabled. The 11th Circuit vacated his sentence after a holistic review of adaptive deficits. Alabama argues 5 IQ scores between 72 and 78 bars exemption. Backing the state, Solicitor General D. John Sauer urged a stricter threshold. The ruling could reset the margins and the margin of error on Atkins, narrowing how states assess disability in capital cases. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 2.5, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.